The whispers of Cain's Fork were a currency of their own, traded in the quiet moments after sundown, in the pregnant pause between the strike of a match and the bloom of a lamp's flame. They were old whispers, worn smooth as river stones, telling of the Thorne sisters, Alara and Lyra, who had lived and died in the tall, gaunt house that loomed over the hollow like a skeletal judge. To the few who spoke of them, they were specters of piety, reclusive saints who had tended their garden and their souls with equal fervor, their passing leaving behind only the scent of dried lavender and the weight of an unspoken story. But other, darker whispers, the kind that were never spoken above a breath, hinted at a wrongness in that house, a shadow that no amount of prayer could dispel. It was into this web of rumor and reverence that Arthur Vance walked in the autumn of 1923. He was a man of the city, a historian by trade, and the last living relative of a family line he had barely known existed. The Thorne house, with its 40 acres of overgrown timber and fallow fields, was now his, a bequest from a great-aunt thrice removed. His arrival was not that of an heir claiming his prize, but that of an archivist drawn to a forgotten document. The house itself was a decomposing text, its peeling paint and boarded windows the faded ink of a story he felt compelled to read. The air in the hollow was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and it clung to him like a shroud. The mountains pressed in, their slopes a dark, oppressive wall that seemed to swallow the light, leaving the hollow in a perpetual twilight. The Thorne house stood on a rise, its sharp gables and vacant, staring windows giving it the aspect of a starved creature. Arthur felt a chill that had little to do with the autumn air. It was a feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by the place itself, by the very soil and stones that had borne witness to the lives lived and ended within those walls. For days, he moved through the rooms like a ghost himself, cataloging the meager remains of two lives. There were hymnals with broken spines, stacks of yellowed linens, and simple, severe furniture. It was a portrait of austerity, of a life stripped bare of all but faith and duty. Yet, the house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. The silence was absolute, a living entity that pressed in on him, broken only by the groan of a floorboard or the sigh of the wind through a cracked pane of glass. It was in the attic, a space choked with dust and the ghosts of forgotten things, that he found it. Tucked away in a large, leather-strapped trunk, beneath a brittle wedding dress that had clearly never been worn, was a small, unassuming book. It was a diary, bound in dark, cracked leather, the kind a young woman might keep. There was no name on the cover, no inscription on the flyleaf. The pages were filled with a tight, controlled script, the ink faded to a rusty brown. Arthur sat on the dusty floorboards, a single beam of light from a grimy window illuminating the page, and began to read. The first entry was dated April 12, 1891. The prose was formal, almost biblical in its cadence, speaking of gratitude for the solitude of the hollow and the divine purity of their shared existence. But it was the last sentence of that first entry that caused the blood to slow in his veins. It read, "Lyra and I are as one, and this house is our vessel. But a stain has appeared on the horizon, a test of our devotion. We must remain vigilant, for the world's filth seeks always to seep through the cracks. We will not allow it. It must be cleansed, a stain, a filth to be cleansed." The words were a stark and violent counterpoint to the pious prose that preceded them. What stain could possibly mar such a deliberately isolated life? He closed the diary, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light. The oppressive silence of the house suddenly felt different. It was no longer empty. It was watchful, and it was waiting. He had not found a simple record of a life. He had found a lock, and somewhere, buried in the dark, was a key. The story of Cain's Fork was about to be rewritten. Arthur knew that a story like this was never confined to a single house. Its roots would run deep into the surrounding community, even if they were buried and unseen. The next morning, he left the cold embrace of the Thorne estate and drove his automobile the few miles into the small, tight-lipped town that serviced the hollows. The town was a collection of gray, clapboard buildings huddled along a single dirt road, a place that seemed to have turned its back on the 20th century. He began at the general store, a dim, cluttered space that smelled of sawdust, tobacco, and dried goods. The proprietor, a man with a face like a knotted piece of wood, watched him with pale, uninterested eyes. Arthur bought a tin of coffee and some provisions, then casually broached the subject. He mentioned he was staying at the old Thorn place, that he'd inherited it. The man's hands, which had been methodically weighing out beans, stilled. "That's so," he said, the words flat and devoid of curiosity. "Pious women, the Thorns," Arthur offered, hoping to prime the pump. "Kept to themselves." The proprietor grunted, a sound of affirmation that was also a dismissal. "People round here respect that. Best to let the dead lie in peace. And there's stories with them." He slid Arthur's change across the counter, his eyes already looking past him, a clear signal that the conversation was over. It was the same at the county clerk's office, where the records were kept in massive, dusty ledgers. The clerk, a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers, was initially helpful, showing him the deed transfer. But when Arthur asked if there were any other records pertaining to the Thorne sisters, any births or deaths registered at that address besides their own, the man's demeanor shifted. He became evasive. "That would have been a long time ago," he stammered, refusing to meet Arthur's gaze. "Records get lost. Fires, floods. Things are forgotten. But you'd have a record of a birth, wouldn't you? A son, perhaps." Arthur pressed, the word son hanging in the musty air. The clerk physically recoiled, shaking his head. "Never heard of no son. Just the two sisters. Alone. That's the story, mister. The only story." The wall was going up brick by silent brick. This was not simple ignorance. It was a concerted, communal effort. It was a conspiracy of silence, practiced and perfected over decades. The final and most formidable brick in that wall was Reverend Michael, a man whose placid smile did not quite reach his cold, assessing eyes. Arthur found him tending the small, immaculately kept graveyard beside his church. He introduced himself, and the Reverend's smile widened. "Mr. Vance, welcome. We are a quiet community, but we hope you find a measure of peace here." Arthur explained his purpose, his historical curiosity, his desire to understand the lives of his forebears. He spoke of the diary, though he did not reveal its dark contents, only that it had raised questions. The Reverend stopped his work, resting his hands on the handle of his spade. His expression became one of grave, paternal concern. "Son," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, somber tone, "some doors are best left unopened. The Thorne sisters were pillars of faith in a faithless time. They were models of purity and devotion. Their memory is a blessing to this valley. But the diary suggests their lives were more complicated," Arthur insisted. "It speaks of a stain, a filth they felt a need to cleanse." Reverend Michael's eyes hardened. The pastoral softness vanished, replaced by something ancient and unyielding. "The world is full of stains, Mr. Vance. The righteous are tested by them every day. The Thorne sisters endured their trials with grace and passed into God's hands, their souls clean. To dig into their past is to cast doubt on their virtue. It is to smear their good name with the very filth they fought to overcome. This community will not abide it. Leave it be. Let them rest." The threat was not overt, but it was unmistakable, woven into the fabric of his pious warning. It was the voice of the community, the voice of the conspiracy, telling him to turn back. As Arthur walked away from the church, the weight of the hollow's silence felt heavier than ever. It was not a passive absence of sound, but an active, suffocating force. It was the sound of a secret being kept, and he now understood that to uncover the truth of the Thorne house, he would have to fight not just the ghosts of the past, but the living guardians of their lives. Returning to the gaunt, lonely house, Arthur felt a profound sense of isolation. The town had closed ranks against him, and the hollow itself seemed to hold its breath, watching him. The house was his only companion, its silence now filled with the echoes of the town's warnings and the cryptic promise of the diary. He built a fire in the hearth, the flickering light pushing back the oppressive gloom, but casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eye. With a glass of whiskey at his side, he opened the leather-bound book again, determined to let its voice, the voice of Alara Thorne, speak to him across the 30 years of silence. The early entries, dated from 1891 through 1892, were a strange and unsettling portrait of a shared life. Alara wrote not as an individual, but as a component of a single entity. Lyra and I took the air today, one entry read. We felt the sun on our skin and knew it for God's grace, a gift he gives only to the pure of heart. Our hearts are as one, and therefore doubly pure. The prose was elegant, almost poetic, but it was the poetry of a sealed tomb. Their world was the house and its immediate grounds. The town was a distant, necessary evil, a place of commerce they visited as infrequently as possible and always together. They were a fortress of two, their bond the high, unbreachable wall. Alara's writing was filled with a fervent, almost ecstatic piety. She and Lyra read the Bible for hours each day, finding in its verses a confirmation of their own secluded virtue. They saw the outside world, the world of men and commerce and messy, unpredictable emotions, as a fallen place, a Sodom from which they had been mercifully delivered. There was a recurring theme of purity, of whiteness. They laundered their linens with a fanatical zeal, scrubbed the floors until the wood was pale, and spoke of their souls in the same terms, as something to be bleached and scrubbed clean of any potential stain. But beneath the surface of this fanatical cleanliness, a disturbing current ran. There was no mention of friends, of family, of any human contact that was not transactional. Their love for each other was described in terms of divine mandate, a perfect, closed loop that required no outside validation. The world believes love is a chaotic, grasping thing, Alara wrote. They are wrong. True love is a placid lake, a mirror in which two souls see only each other, and in that reflection, see the face of God. Lyra is my mirror, and I am hers. All else is distortion. The bond was not one of sisterly affection. It was one of absolute fusion. There were not two people. There were a single being in two bodies. This idea, repeated in a dozen different ways, began to feel less like a statement of love and more like a carefully constructed doctrine, a justification for their profound and unnatural isolation. Arthur read on, page after page of this suffocating, self-contained world. He felt a growing sense of dread. This was not the diary of a normal, religious woman. It was the testament of a mind, or two minds, that had walled themselves off from reality, creating a private theology in which they were the sole arbiters of good and evil. The language was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a perfectly preserved corpse. He wondered about Lyra. Did she feel the same? Or was she a prisoner of Alara's stronger will? The diary gave no clue. In its pages, Lyra was not a person, but a concept, a reflection, an echo of Alara herself. And then, in the winter of 1893, the placid surface of a lake was broken. The tone of the diary began to shift, the controlled, elegant script showing the first signs of agitation. The entries grew shorter, more frequent, and a new word entered Alara's vocabulary, visitor. The change was as sudden as a crack appearing in a frozen pond. For years, the diary had been a placid, if unnerving, chronicle of self-imposed exile. Then, in an entry dated November 7th, 1893, the word appeared. A visitor came to the hollow today. Not to our door, praise the Lord, but his presence is a disruption. A surveyor, they say. He moves through the woods with his instruments, marking the land, imposing the world's geometry upon God's wilderness. Lyra feels his presence as a sickness in the air. I have told her we must pray for his departure. The entries that followed were filled with a mounting anxiety. The surveyor, a man named only as Mr. Cole, became an obsession. He was no longer just a man doing a job. He was an agent of the outside world, a symbol of the filth Alara had long feared. He makes noise, she wrote, the script now slightly slanted as if written in haste. The sound of his axe echoes in the valley. It is a violation. He whistles a worldly tune. It is a serpent song. We have drawn the curtains on the west side of the house, but we can still feel him, a foreign body in the pure flesh of our solitude. Arthur felt a prickle of suspense. This was the stain she had written of in the very first entry. It was not a concept, but a person, a man. The diary did not record any direct interaction. The sisters, it seemed, went to great lengths to avoid him, their trips to town ceasing altogether. They were under siege, their fortress of two surrounded by a single, unknowing man. The paranoia festering in Alara's prose was palpable. She wrote of seeing him from a distance, a dark shape moving against the snow. She described his tools, his tripod and chains, as instruments of corruption, tentacles of a world they had renounced. Lyra saw him look toward the house today. An entry from December read, "She came to me, pale as winter milk. She said his eyes were like a wolf's. I told her it is not him we see, but the sin he carries with him, the sin of all men. We must be stronger. Our faith is our shield. Our house is our armor." But their armor, it seemed, was not impenetrable. A few weeks later, a new and terrible note of desperation entered the diary. The entries became fragmented, thoughts spilling onto the page in a torrent of fear and fury. A transgression, a defilement. He came onto our land, not to the house, but he crossed the creek, our boundary. He left footprints in the snow. An invasion. He has poisoned the very ground we walk upon. Lyra has not stopped weeping. The mirror is cracked. What could have happened? Arthur wondered. A simple trespass? It seemed an absurd overreaction. But in the hermetically sealed world of Alara and Lyra Thorne, it was an act of war. The surveyor was no longer just a symbol. He was a direct threat, a physical impurity that had breached their defenses. And then, a single entry dated January 4th, 1894, stopped Arthur's heart. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, the words tumbling over one another. The necessary sin, the terrible duty. The world would not leave us be, so we must take a piece of its filth and consecrate it. A vessel is required. A penance must be made flesh. Lyra does not understand. She sees only the horror. I see the path. It is a path through fire, but it leads to purity. God will forgive us, for he has commanded it. The words made no sense, yet they were filled with a terrible, looming logic. A necessary sin, a vessel, penance made flesh. It was the language of ritual, of a dark and twisted theology. The next several pages of the diary were blank. The unbroken chronicle of their lives suddenly ceased, leaving a void of white paper that was more terrifying than any words could be. When the entries resumed, nearly a year later, the surveyor was gone. There was no mention of his departure, no note of relief. It was as if he had never existed. But something had changed. The tone of the diary was different. The ecstatic piety was gone, replaced by a grim, joyless sense of purpose. And in a short, stark entry from the late autumn of 1894, Alara Thorne wrote a sentence that explained everything and nothing at all. The penance has begun. Cain is with us. The diary had become a map of a poisoned land, but Arthur lacked the legend to decipher its symbols. Cain is with us. Who was Cain? The name, heavy with biblical fratricide, was a declaration of sin. But whose sin? And what was the penance? The silence of the house and the town had defeated him. He needed an interpreter, someone who could read the lines of the past that were invisible to an outsider. He needed an ally. The name Martha had come up once, in a muttered aside at the general store. When Arthur had pressed about who might remember the Thorns, the proprietor had waved a dismissive hand toward the edge of the hollow. Might be old Martha Cade is still kicking. She's half-cracked. Been living in that shack since the flood of '05. Used to do odd jobs for folks way back. It was a thin lead, but it was the only one he had. He found the shack tucked into a fold of the mountain, barely distinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. It was a dilapidated thing of scrap wood and rusted tin, a curl of smoke a pail, lonely signal from its crumbling chimney. An old woman sat on the porch, wrapped in a collection of mismatched shawls, her face a roadmap of wrinkles. She watched his approach with eyes that were cloudy with age but missed nothing. This was Martha Cade. Getting her to speak was like trying to draw water from a dry well. She was suspicious, her voice a reedy whisper. She remembered the Thorne sisters, but spoke of them in the same reverent, distant terms as the townspeople. Saints they were, kept to themselves. Never a bad word to say about anyone, 'cause they never spoke to anyone. I'm not here to speak ill of them, Arthur said, his voice gentle. He sat on the bottom step of her porch, keeping a respectful distance. I'm their family. I'm just trying to understand. I found a diary. It speaks of a child, a son named Cain. The name was a key, a flicker of something, fear, memory, recognition, passed across the old woman's face. She looked away, toward the dark line of the trees. Ain't no son, she whispered, the words a rote denial. Never was. Arthur decided to take a risk. He opened his notebook, where he had transcribed a line from the diary. It says, "The penance has begun. Cain is with us." What does it mean, Martha? What penance? She flinched as if he had struck her. Her gnarled hands tightened on the arms of her rocking chair. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the chair and the wind in the pines. You leave it be, she finally said, her voice thin but sharp. You're like that other one, the surveyor, asking questions that ain't got no good answers. The surveyor, Mr. Cole, the man from the diary. You remember him? Arthur asked, his pulse quickening. He came here, asking about them. Martha nodded slowly, her eyes distant. He was a kind man, not from around here. He was sweet on Lyra, the pretty one, the quiet one. He'd leave her little things on the property line, a handful of winter berries, a bird's feather. He just wanted to court her. This was not in the diary. Alara's version was of a monstrous invader. Martha's was a story of a simple, unrequited courtship. What happened to him? Arthur asked. He just vanished, Martha said. One day he was there, the next he was gone. Folks figured he finished his work and moved on. But his gear was still in the room he rented at the boarding house. Never came back for it. A cold knot formed in Arthur's stomach. He looked at Martha, at her frightened eyes. The child, Martha. Tell me about the child. The old woman began to cry, silent tears that carved new paths through the dust on her cheeks. I was just a girl, she whispered. My ma helped out at the Thorne place sometimes with the heavy work. They were strange, the sisters, always watching, always whispering to each other. Then, for nigh on a year, we weren't called up there. Doors were locked. No one saw them. Then my ma got a note. To come. She took me with her. Her voice dropped lower, becoming a conspiratorial, horrified hiss. There was a baby in a cradle. A boy. They said they'd found him, abandoned on their doorstep. A gift from God, they called him. But he had Lyra's eyes, the same blue. And he had a little crooked finger, just like that surveyor man. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. The courtship, the transgression, the necessary sin. It wasn't an abstract theological concept. It was a plan, a monstrous, deliberate plan. They lured him? Arthur breathed, the question a statement. Martha just nodded, rocking back and forth, a low moan escaping her lips. They were never with a man. Never. Then one day, there's a child they called Cain. And the man who looked like him was gone forever. The drive back to the Thorne house was a blur. Martha's words echoed in Arthur's mind, a horrifying counter-narrative to Alara's diary. The visitor was not an invader. He was a suitor. The transgression was not a trespass. It was a seduction, or worse, a trap. And the penance was not a foundling. He was a child, Lyra's child, the surveyor's son. With this new, terrible knowledge, the diary was no longer an enigma. It was a confession. Arthur threw another log on the fire, the flames leaping up as if eager to consume the house's secrets. He opened the book to the entries after the long silence, after the birth of the boy they named Cain. The elegant, pious prose had returned, but it was now laced with a cold, cruel purpose. Alara no longer wrote of the beauty of their solitude, but of the righteousness of their task. The vessel is weak, she wrote of the infant. It cries for one of worldly comfort. It does not understand that it is an instrument of God's will. Its purpose is not to be loved, but to be a vessel for the sin we have taken upon ourselves. Through its suffering, we are purified. The child was not their son. He was not even a person. He was a theological object, a living sacrifice. The diary chronicled their raising of him, and it was a catalog of systematic dehumanization. He was not held, not coddled. He was fed, clothed, and cleaned with a detached, clinical efficiency, as if he were a piece of livestock. Alara wrote of it with a chilling pride. Lyra's weakness is a trial. One entry read. She looks upon the vessel and sees a child. I have had to remind her of the scripture of the wages of sin. She weeps in the night. Her faith wavers. I must be strong for us both. I have taken over the feedings. I will not let sentimentality corrupt our holy work. The surveyor, Mr. Cole, was never mentioned again. He was a loose end, a narrative inconvenience that had been snipped and discarded. Arthur thought of the man's tools, left behind in his boarding room, a silent testament to a life cut short. Had they killed him? The diary was silent on the matter, but the implication was as cold and hard as the winter ground. They had needed a vessel, and once the seed was planted, the sower was no longer required. It was a seduction, a murder, and a birth, all part of a single, monstrous plan conceived in the crucible of their shared madness. Alara called it the immaculate sin, an act of violation and creation deliberately undertaken not for passion, but for a twisted, self-serving notion of spiritual purity. They had seen a man's innocent affection for Lyra not as a blessing, but as an opportunity. They had lured him in, used him for their purpose, and then, in all likelihood, buried him somewhere on the 40 acres of land that had become their kingdom and their prison. The child, Cain, was the living proof of this act. To the world, if the world had ever been allowed to see, he was a foundling. To the sisters, he was a tool. His life was to be a long, drawn-out atonement for a sin they had meticulously engineered. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He was not just reading a story of abuse. He was reading the philosophical justification for it, written by the perpetrator. The horror was not just in the act, but in the cold, rational, self-righteous belief that the act was holy. He looked around the room, at the severe furniture, the bare walls. This was not a house of God. It was a laboratory, and a small, innocent boy had been its subject. The diary was a record of the experiment, an experiment in the total eradication of a human soul. And as Arthur read on, he realized with dawning horror that the experiment was far from over. The boy was growing up. The diary became a chronicle of a childhood that was not a childhood at all. It was an imprisonment. The boy, Cain, was never allowed outside the house. The world that his father, the surveyor, had come to map was a forbidden country. His only landscape was the pattern on the wallpaper, his only sky the water-stained ceiling. His only companions were his mother and his aunt, who were also his jailers, his theologians, and his tormentors. Alara's entries detailed his education with the same dispassionate precision she used to describe mending a sheet. He was taught to read, but only from the Bible, and not from the Gospels of love and forgiveness, but from the punitive, wrathful books of the Old Testament. He learned of Lot's wife, of the flood, of the cities of the plain. His world was built of sin and retribution. He was not called Cain with any affection. He was the vessel, the stain, or simply the boy. His own name was a curse, a brand. Today, the vessel spoke his given name. Alara wrote when the boy was perhaps 4 or 5. He said, "I am Cain." I corrected him. "You are sin," I said. "You are the filth of the world made flesh. Your name is a reminder of your nature. He must not be allowed to form an identity. He is not a person. He is a condition." The psychological cruelty was breathtaking in its scope and its intimacy. Every natural, childish impulse was reframed as a sign of his inherent corruption. If he laughed, it was the sound of foolishness. If he cried, it was the weakness of the flesh. If he asked a question, it was a challenge to God's authority. His life was a cage built of scripture and silence. Lyra, his mother, remained a ghost in the narrative, a source of weakness that Alara constantly had to correct. Lyra attempted to sing a lullaby to the vessel tonight, one chilling entry detailed. A worldly tune from her own childhood. I had to intervene. The boy must not know comfort. He must not know tenderness. His path is one of affliction, is the only path to our salvation. I found Lyra weeping in her room. I read to her from Leviticus until she was calm. Arthur could picture it. The small boy, hungry for a moment of affection, and the two sisters, one offering a flicker of maternal love, the other extinguishing it with a cold blast of dogma. It was a war for the boy's soul, and Alara, with her iron will and twisted faith, was winning. As Cain grew from a boy into a youth, a new tension entered the diary. He was becoming a man, his body changing, and this physical manifestation of the original sin was a source of profound agitation for Alara. The vessel grows, she wrote. The sin of his origin is making itself known in his flesh. He is tall, like the surveyor. He has his hands. I see Lyra looking at him, and I see the memory of that filth in her eyes. The penance is becoming a constant, living reminder of the fall. This cannot be borne forever. A final purification will be necessary. The language grew more and more ominous. Alara began to research the scriptures for precedents, for justification for a final cleansing. She wrote of sacrifices, of rendering unto God what is God's, of the cutting off of a corrupted limb to save the body. The diary, which had begun as a testament to a pure life, was now methodically, rationally, building a case for murder. It was not a crime of passion she was planning, but a theological necessity. The boy was no longer a useful tool for their purification. His very existence had become a contamination. He had served his purpose. He had been their living hair shirt for over a decade, and now his presence was a source of shame and memory, not salvation. The final entries of this period were short and terrifyingly calm. The vessel has begun to look out the windows. His eyes have a hunger for the world. This cannot be. The stain must not be allowed to spread. It must be contained. It must be erased, not just from the house, but from memory, from the world itself. Lyra agrees. She is weak, but she understands. The mirror must be made whole again. The reflection must be made pure. Arthur felt a cold sweat on his brow. He was no longer a historian reading a document. He was a witness, standing on the edge of a precipice, watching a tragedy unfold in slow, excruciating detail. He knew what was coming. The murder from the title of his own imagined story was not a mystery to be solved. It was a verdict, and the diary was the executioner's meticulous record. The end, when it came, was recorded by Alara with the same cold, clerical precision she had used to document Cain's entire tragic life. The catalyst was a small act of defiance, the first and last true assertion of his own will. The diary entry, dated in the spring of what Arthur calculated to be 1909, was longer than most, a final testament in justification. A turning point, Alara wrote. The final, unforgivable sin. The vessel has been watching the birds through the attic window. We have seen him. His eyes follow their flight. Today, I found a small thing he has been hiding under his mattress. A piece of scrap wood, carved into the rough shape of a bird. A crude, ugly thing, but its meaning is a blasphemy. It is the image of escape. It is the idol of a world we have renounced. To Alara, this was not a boy's desperate carving, a pathetic symbol of a yearning for freedom. It was an act of idolatry, a rejection of the cage they had so carefully constructed for him. It was proof that the stain could not be controlled, that it possessed its own will, its own desire. It had to be eradicated completely. I confronted him with it. The entry continued. I asked him what it was. He did not answer in scripture. He did not cast his eyes down in shame. He looked at me, at his jailer, and for the first time, I saw not a vessel, but a person in his eyes. A stranger. It was the surveyor's gaze. The eyes of the world. He said, "It is a bird. It can fly away." Then he spoke his own name. "My name is Cain," he said. It was not a confession. It was a declaration. For Alara, this was the ultimate failure of their experiment. The soul they had tried to erase had survived. It had a name. It had a desire. It had to be silenced. Lyra understands now. The memory of the surveyor in his eyes has broken her last reserve of weakness. The vessel is no longer a penance. It is a haunting, a ghost of our transgression that walks the halls of our house. It must be laid to rest, permanently. The next entry, dated 2 nights later, was chillingly practical. The preparations are made. The cellar has been ready for some time. A space behind the far wall where the earth is soft. It is not a grave. It is a return. We will return the sin to the unhallowed ground from which it came. He will be sealed away, as he should have been from the start. We will give him milk with his supper. The tincture from the poppy flowers in the garden is strong. He will sleep. He will not suffer. It is an act of mercy. It is the final purification. Arthur had to stop reading. He stood up and paced the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could picture the scene. The 2 sisters, moving with a calm, ritualistic purpose. The boy, perhaps 18 years old, finally tasting a moment of defiance, unaware that it had signed his death warrant. The drugged milk. The descent into the dark, damp cellar. This wasn't a murder committed in a fit of rage. It was a slow, premeditated, and holy execution. He forced himself to read the final entry in the diary. It was short, the handwriting once again the perfect, controlled script of the very first page. It is done. The house is quiet. The stain is cleansed. The vessel has been returned to the earth. There is no more talk of birds. There are no more strange eyes watching us. There is only silence. A pure, blessed silence. Lyra and I are one again. The mirror is whole. Arthur closed the book. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cold. The silence of the house was no longer just oppressive. It was the silence of a tomb that contained not just the Thorne sisters, but a secret they had walled up in the dark, a boy named Cain whose only crime was the desire to fly away. The diary was not just a confession. It was a map, and Arthur knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to follow it to its destination. The morning was gray and cold, a fitting shroud for the task ahead. Arthur took a lantern and a heavy sledgehammer from the old shed, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were taking part in a grim ceremony. The cellar stairs groaned under his weight, leading him down into the damp, earthy-smelling darkness. The air was thick and still, the kind of air that has not been disturbed for decades. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, a labyrinth of stone and earth. Shelves lined the walls, holding the ghostly outlines of jars that had long since been emptied. In the flickering light of the lantern, his own shadow loomed and danced like a nervous specter. He walked to the far wall, the one Alara had described in her final, terrible entry. It was a section of fieldstone wall, but just as the diary had promised, something was different. The mortar was a slightly different color, a bit paler, and the stones were set with a less practiced hand than the surrounding wall. It was the work of 2 women, not a stonemason. It was a patch, a seal. He placed the lantern on an empty shelf, its light casting the wall in stark relief. He could see it clearly now, a roughly rectangular section, about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide. The size of a doorway, the size of a tomb. For a moment, he hesitated. This was no longer an academic exercise. To break this wall was to cross a line, to desecrate a grave, however unholy. It was to make the abstract horror of the diary a physical, tangible reality. He thought of the Reverend Michael's warning, "Let the dead lie in peace." But Cain wasn't at peace. He was entombed in a lie, his memory erased, his existence denied by an entire community. To leave him here would be to become complicit in that silence. He thought of the carved bird, the boy's small, desperate act of creation. That was the truth. The wall was the lie. He hefted the sledgehammer. It felt impossibly heavy in his hands. He took a deep breath of the musty air and swung. The hammer struck the wall with a deafening crack, the sound echoing in the confined space. A spiderweb of fractures appeared in the mortar. He swung again and again, the rhythmic, brutal impacts a drumbeat against the house's long silence. Dust and a shower of dried mortar filled the air, and a stone came loose, then another. A dark, black void began to appear. A smell wafted out, not of decay which had long since passed, but of dry earth, of dust, and of something else, something profoundly still and sad. He worked with a feverish energy, pulling the stones out by hand, his knuckles scraping against the rough rock. Soon, the opening was large enough to peer into. He held the lantern high and looked. It was a small, coffin-sized chamber, barely larger than a crypt. And in the center of the dusty floor, there was a pile of what he had known, with sickening certainty, he would find. The bones of a young man, folded in on themselves, lay in a heap, returned to the earth just as Alara had commanded. The skeleton was almost complete, the white of the bones stark against the dark soil. Arthur felt a profound, bottomless sorrow. This was it. This was the cleansed stain. This was Cain. He lowered himself into the small, dark space, the air thick with the dust of a forgotten life. He knelt beside the remains, an unwilling priest at a profane altar. And then he saw it, lying amongst the delicate bones of the hand, so small he had almost missed it, was a small, dark object. He picked it up, his fingers trembling. It was the bird, the crude, wooden bird, carved from a piece of scrap wood. It had survived. It had lain here in the dark, clutched in a dead boy's hand for 30 years, a silent, defiant testament. The boy had been buried, but his dream had not. Arthur stood, cradling the small, pathetic carving in his palm. The horror of the place, the weight of the sister's crime, was immense. But in his hand, he held the counterpart. He held the proof of a soul that had refused to be erased. The walk from a thorn house to the church was the longest of Arthur's life. The small wooden bird felt heavy in his pocket, a relic of a forgotten martyr. The sky was the color of lead, and a cold rain had begun to fall, washing the dust from the air, but it could not wash away the feeling of grim purpose that had settled over him. He found Reverend Michael in his study, a small, book-lined room that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. The Reverend looked up from his desk, his pastoral smile firmly in place, but it faltered when he saw Arthur's face. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice holding a note of caution, "I had hoped you had decided to let this matter rest." Arthur didn't speak. He walked to the desk and placed two objects on its polished surface: the leather-bound diary, and beside it, a small, crudely carved wooden bird. The Reverend stared at the objects, his face a mask of confusion that slowly gave way to a dawning, horrified comprehension. He looked from the diary to the bird, and then to Arthur's hard, unforgiving eyes. "I know the story," Arthur said, his voice low and even. "The real story. Not the one this town tells itself. Not the legend of the pious Thorn sisters." He opened the diary to the last page, the one written after the boy had been sealed in the cellar. He pushed it across the desk. "Read it," he commanded. The Reverend's hands trembled as he picked up the book. He read the final, damning entry, his face growing paler with every word. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes wide with a fear that was not for himself, but for the myth he was sworn to protect. "It is the writing of a mad woman," he whispered, his voice thin. "It proves nothing." "This proves it," Arthur said, tapping the wooden bird. "I found it, in his hand, exactly where she said he would be. I broke down the wall. Reverend, I found him." The last vestiges of the Reverend's composure crumbled. He sank back in his chair, his face ashen. He looked like an old man, the weight of a secret carried for a lifetime finally crushing him. "I was just a boy when they died," he said, his voice barely audible. "My father was the preacher then. He knew. He didn't know all of it. Not this horror. But he knew they were hiding something. He told me the stories of the sisters were a kindness. A way to let the darkness of that house die with them. A way to keep the hollow from being known for such a thing. A kindness?" Arthur's voice was sharp with a righteous fury. "You built a shrine to monsters and erased their victim. You let a boy named Cain, your community's own son, rot in a forgotten hole while you praised his murderers as saints. That is not kindness. It is a conspiracy. It is a lie." The Reverend had no answer. He could only stare at the diary, at the small wooden bird, the evidence of a truth his town had spent half a century trying to bury. There would be no trial, no legal justice. Alara and Lyra Thorne were long dead, buried in the very churchyard the reverends so carefully tended, their headstone proclaiming them devout sisters at rest in the arms of the Lord. The only reckoning was here, in this room. It was the death of a lie. It was the shattering of a carefully constructed myth. Arthur took back the diary, but he left the wooden bird on the desk. His name was Cain, he said, his voice now filled with a deep, weary sorrow. He was not a stain. He was a boy who wanted to see the sky. That is his story. You can tell it, or you can continue to tend the graves of his killers. That is your penance. He turned and walked out of the study, out of the church, and did not look back. He left Cain's Fork that same day. He sold the house and the land to a timber company, wanting nothing more to do with that cursed ground. But he did not forget. The story was no longer a whisper in a dark hollow. It was a known tragedy, a testament to the monstrous shapes that evil can take, even when cloaked in the robes of piety. And sometimes, in the quiet of his own study, surrounded by the true and honest histories of the world, Arthur would think of that dark cellar, and of the profound, unshakable truth that some secrets are so terrible they refuse to be sealed in the dark, and that even a soul that is never allowed to fly can leave behind a sign that it was, for a short and tragic time there.